right, welcome to TAG's first Under the Dome session. I do see that people are coming in unmuted, so if you could mute, that would be great. Not sure what happened, but Zoom's not cooperating today, so just make sure that you're muted. So I do, again, want to welcome everybody for our first Under the Dome session. These conversations are really focused on making sure that we still have access to the conversations and the connections that we normally would during our legislative session, given our COVID environment. And I do want to say, I want to thank our sponsors for this series. We have HNTB, the Goodman Corporation, and EHRA. We really appreciate your support for this series. And as always, we appreciate the support of all of our mobility partners, which were featured at the end of the video. They are LJA Engineering, Geotest, Outreach Strategists, S&B, Infrastructure, Raytech, Danabaum Engineering, LAN, WSP, Uptown, Half Associates, Robert Kistner, HNTB, and Union Pacific. So with that, I do want to invite everyone to ask questions when we get to the Q&A portion of the program. You can use the chat box to message me directly with your question. I can ask it for you, or you can ask it yourself. I do want to remind everybody that when we talk about these conversations and we want to stay on track with what's going on with session, the hashtag TXLEGE is a great one to stay up on all the conversations that happened today and moving forward. So with that, we are honored to have Comptroller Len Hegar kick off the series for us. If you remember, he helped us kick off our Legend Learn series, which was wildly successful. So you're good luck, Comptroller. And we did about 20 of those sessions. And so we've got a lot of Under the Dome sessions planned ahead as well. But today we are so honored to have you here. And so with that, I'm going to let you take over.
Get myself off mute first. All right, first things first. So it's good to be with you again. Obviously, kind of like I've always said, you know, much better to be in person than virtually, but so are the days 2020 carrying over to 21. But it's always good to be with the group and visit with you. Look forward to answering some of the questions. So I'll kind of give you a little wrap up of where we're at economically here in the state of Texas. Most of you recall last year, unfortunately, in March, I had to use that word recession, that we knew Texas was unfortunately going to have some type of recession with both the double headwinds of the pandemic as well as lower oil and gas prices. So we wanted several months of data. Last July, we gave a revised revenue forecast, and just for the current 2-year budget, as most of you all know, the state legislature is in session. They are going to work on any type of just the current 2-year budget. There's usually some unpaid expenses when you put the budget together, at least from a revenue side and expenditure side. Here in legislative session, you're looking at starting a state budget in September and then running for the next 2 years. So that's a very long window. So there's always a few expenses the legislature has to pay for. And so last legislative session, before the pandemic, we thought we had about a $3 billion surplus in the current 2-year budget. Last summer, unfortunately, we had to announce that we thought it'd be a $4.5 billion deficit. However, revenues have come in the Treasury stronger than we anticipated, which is good news. First and foremost, if you look at the state budget overall, 1/3 is federal dollars, 2/3 is state dollars. Of the state dollar portion, I always remind everybody that sales tax is about 60% of all tax collections. And so therefore, every stream of revenue is extremely important, but for the health of the overall Treasury, sales tax is extremely important. So if you look at industries that have been impacted, that are continuing to be impacted, those such as hotels, hospitality, leisure, travel, vacation, those areas are significantly continue to be impacted. Oil and gas revenues continue to be impacted. And so therefore, the point being is hotel occupancy tax, severance tax collections are still down double digit. Yet sales tax collections we had anticipated would be down roughly almost 10% for about a year. Instead, they've been averaging about 5%, down lower each month compared to the year before. Now that's on average, obviously it's ebbed and flowed. And so therefore the point being, in short, the revenues into the Treasury for the current fiscal year are slightly better shape than we anticipated. One, because sales tax revenues were not down as much. Secondly, you probably heard me mention before that last legislative session, I'd asked the legislature to pass 2 pieces of legislation that was in response to the U.S. Supreme Court decision on the Wayfair, which essentially has to be about us being able to, if we go to the local corner store, the local retail strip, we're going to actually pay sales tax, and then if we buy items online from a fairness perspective to make sure that there's not a competitive advantage for those online. Online purchases have been increasing, but they have drastically increased over the course of the last 12 months as a result of the pandemic. And so we'd asked the legislature to pass two pieces of legislation. One that had to do with what we call marketplace providers. So people that sell through a platform such as Amazon, eBay, Etsy, Wayfair. There's a whole bunch of them. There's over 500 that are registered with us, but obviously the bigger ones are the ones we recall and recognize that those marketplace providers have to collect and remit sales tax to us, not only for the state, but obviously the local portion as well. And then anyone selling directly to you and I, the consumers, what are called remote sellers. So we had originally thought that that piece of legislation that would bring in about $500 million to the state of Texas in a 12-month period. And in fact, in part, because the pandemic and people buying much more items online than they were going to stores, thankfully, the legislature passed it because instead of $500 million, it was $1.3 billion to the state treasury. That also meant local governments, those that derive a portion of retail sales, sales tax collections, was about $350 million. So that has helped. And then lastly, obviously the state has received a significant amount of money from the federal government in the different COVID packages. And so therefore some of those dollars were for specific type expenses and some of them are for COVID in general. And some of those dollars are going to be transplanted in essence for state revenue, general revenue that we would have spent instead of federal dollars. And so all combined, instead of having that $4.5 billion deficit, it looks like $1 billion in the current 2-year budget cycle, which is good news. Now, the legislature had asked, the leadership had asked state agencies to reduce their expenditures by 5% for the current biennium. We thought that that would be about $1 billion savings. It looks as though it's about a little over $860 million. So in essence, this current 2-year budget cycle is in good shape. And so therefore going forward, the upcoming biennium, the new revenue estimate, we're very confident in the numbers that we provided the legislature a few weeks ago. However, I have noted over and over again, and you'll hear me say this all the time, you've heard me in the past, that when you're projecting out 9 months and then that revenue estimate is going to end 2 years later, there's a lot of uncertainty in that estimate. We're very tied to the international economy. We're 19% of all the exports out of the United States, which is by far the leading export state. And the reason I make those points is that anything that happens in other countries can have some type of impact on our state economy. And so therefore, right now, there's more uncertainty in the revenue estimate than ever before. A lot of questions go as to what is the rollout of the vaccine, how well you and I as consumers continue to adapt, how do we continue to engage in the economy. There's this tremendous amount of savings that people have saved. There's a reluctance to engage in the economy to some degree. So does consumer confidence continue to improve? People ask me what industry sector is going to lead us out of this. In fact, every industry sector is extremely important, but I think the most important part is us as consumers and consumer confidence. And so what I'm getting at is, in short, is that every couple months of data is extremely important. It gives us a little bit better glimpse of the direction of the state economy, the national economy, and the global economy. And so therefore people ask me, are you going to provide a new revenue estimate? In essence, if we need to give one, it'll be on the back end of April, beginning of May. As a former legislator, I know that's the key timeline to make sure that any adjustments to the state treasury and the state budget would be extremely important. From a transportation funding standpoint, and I think that's something that's important to everyone here on this call today, is that in short, we see that revenues from the state side going over to fund transportation will be for this current year is about 8.3 billion, about 8.2 next year, and then moving up to about 8.7 in the second year of the new biennium that the legislature is funding for. One important piece is sales tax, the 2.5 billion. We felt as though that would be funded to transportation. Last summer, we felt as though there'd be a little over 1.3 billion that would not go to TxDOT in August of this year, because the way it works is the month we receive it, we send it over, transfer it to Fund 6 the following month. And so originally we'd anticipated not quite a little over 1.3 billion to be collected in August of this year and be transferred in the state highway fund come September. So therefore it would fall into a new fiscal year for the state. However, because sales tax revenues have not been as deep as we thought they would be negative, therefore actually all of that should fall into this fiscal year is the point. And so that will continue. Deposits from severance tax collections last year or about $1 billion to both the state highway fund and the state savings account. We think that will move up to about 1.35 billion come November of this year. We collect it in the fiscal year and we transfer it 90 days later up to, and then in the second year of the upcoming biennium, we think that would move up to about 1.6 billion. So if you look at the oil and gas industry, they are recovering, but it's slow. So we think production volumes will continue to increase, but incrementally through this year. Prices, even though they're a little over $50 a barrel right now, we think for this fiscal year, they'll be in the mid 40s, slowly inching up. Now, obviously, again, that is one of the more volatile commodities. It's the one more volatile markets. Something could happen, something internationally to cause prices to go up or down. And so anyway, you know, right now we're being conservative in our estimate when it comes to the oil and gas industry. So why don't I stop there? Why don't we transition to questions, Andrea, from maybe the group, yourself, or whoever wants to, and we'll go from that direction instead of me just talking for the entire period that we're here together today.
I appreciate that. Well, you always have to know a lot. I'm so impressed by all that you have to know at any given time. So we do have a question from Jim Webb with Goodman Corporation, asking for understanding that the current projections for the transportation numbers, but how it compares to prior years, and kind of if you could kind of set that stage for us.
Yeah, so originally, at least the main part is severance tax collections. That's the biggest piece. So if you look at the last couple of years, transfers have been somewhere around 1.4 billion to 1.6 billion. As I mentioned, last November, it was $1 billion. So roughly $500 million to $600 million less. And so therefore, as we move forward, we think that'll slowly inch back up, but it'll still be $300 or $400 million less per year for this year. And then slowly getting back to what was kind of the normal funding range. Now, obviously, when we did that many years ago from a severance tax perspective, we knew that that would ebb and flow. There's volatility. I have a chart that I hand out to the legislature, just kind of making the point, when you look at streams of revenue in the state treasury, oil and gas severance tax is the most volatile. Make the point that from one year to next, the average increase had been about 8% on average from year to year. However, I challenge them to look up and down that chart over the last 20 years that the data is showing, and there's not a single year where it's a single digit increase or decrease, you know, and so therefore it's wild increases. And so therefore we knew that, you know, any type of money going to the transportation funding would be important. However, with that being said, there was going to be swings that happened to be in it, and TxDOT obviously tries to take that into account. Now, the last point to make in that is, which is an important question, a little bit off, is, as y'all know, there's been a thing called the sufficient balance, and that's how much money we retain in the Economic Stabilization Fund or the rainy day fund. So, in other words, if that fund in the state savings account goes below the sufficient balance, well, then therefore no money goes to TxDOT until that bucket is full. And then dollar for dollar, one will stay in the savings account, one will go over to fund transportation. Now that that sufficient balance had been around $7.5 billion. The legislature had picked that as a target. Last session, I'd asked them that it would be much simpler and easier if we would have a percentage of general revenue, and going forward, just have that continue to ebb and flow with the state budget. So that number will slowly move up to about $8 billion. The Economic Stabilization Fund has a little over $9 billion in it after expenses from the legislature from last session, which was as a result of some one-time expenses plus a lot of dollars that had to do with flood related and Hurricane Harvey. And so therefore, we think if they don't touch the Economic Stabilization Fund come 2 years from now, if we're having this discussion, it'll have a little over $11.5 billion. And so, you know, they may spend some money out of it. However, right now, as we look, I don't think there'll be a significant withdrawal out of the state savings account. They may have a couple one-time expenses they want to do for either the current budget or the upcoming new 2-year budget that they're starting to work on. However, I don't think there'll be a significant draw as the economy looks today.
Okay, we have another question. Raj Basavaraju, who's on our board, wanted to talk a little bit about some of the COVID dollars. Raj, are you on?
I am. Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, Comptroller. Thank you for presenting today. Really appreciate that, both as a TAT board member and a Houstonian. So quick question is that, do you think there is an option within the COVID federal dollars that the state is receiving to use it for any transportation specific needs?
Yeah, I think at least the dollars that we have received, either they're for specific type expenses and or the COVID type, which I think you're specifically talking about. There was large amounts of money that was to the state specifically for COVID, as well as local governments. The biggest 18 in population, city of Houston, Harris County, received theirs directly from the U.S. Treasury, where other local governments, it passed through the governor's office and the Department of Emergency Management to those local entities. I do not think that, at least according to the Treasury rules and guidance, they're pretty strict on what those dollars can be used for. Now, I haven't looked at it for a while, but I don't think it's specifically able to be used for transportation funding in general. It's more directly related to COVID type expenses. Now, with that being said, some of those are being able to be utilized for payroll, for example, for certain employees that were engaged very heavily in COVID type expenses, COVID related. And so therefore, some of those dollars that were state dollars will be freed up to be for either other purposes, since those federal dollars are there. But in short, at least as the Treasury rules that I've seen, I don't recall that they could be used directly for transportation type projects.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And then I know Michelle McScood with Dannenbaum has a question about the percentage, I think. Michelle?
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Hegar. Always good to see you. Always good to listen to your story. You tell a very compelling, factual stuff. I love it. So did I, among the sea of numbers that you listed, I don't know if I understood correctly, as far as transportation funding is concerned only, did I understand correctly, we're down 5% from prior years? Did I get that right, or I missed it?
Yeah, so if you look at least from a severance tax perspective, those transfers is probably down around $500 million is in short. So instead of being about $1.5 billion, it was $1.1 billion this last calendar year when we made that transfer over from the last fiscal year, at least from dollars from the collections of motor fuel was slightly down. However, obviously it was not as impacted as we thought, as a few more people were traveling around. So really we're talking about $500 million or a little more as a number wise.
Which would make, I mean, I thought you said like 8.2 this year, 8.2 billion this year, and 8.7.
And then going back up to 8.7. That's the state side. State highway funding overall here in the upcoming 2 years would be about 12.5 and 12.6. The federal dollars, I don't have those in front of me. We get those obviously from TxDOT, and they ebb and flow a little bit, but we didn't see those as, at least the information we got from TxDOT, we didn't see those as fundamentally changing from last year to this year to next year. They've been relatively stable.
But these particular numbers, the 8.2 and 8.7, are they? I don't remember what they were before from a state perspective. Do you?
So last fiscal year, a current fiscal year is about 8.3, and so 8.3, 8.2, then going up to 8.7. It's been slightly higher than that, but not substantially higher.
Perfect.
So again, you're somewhere around $500 million or so.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Michelle. Great questions. I appreciate all of our engineers and our math numbers. I love it. So thank you so much. I think the comptroller likes it too, right? We get to get down in those numbers.
I don't have a problem with numbers, as y'all know from all the years.
That's a good, yeah. This is true. I want to switch to our chairman, Mustafa Tamiz. He has a question for you as well. Okay. Mustafa?
Thank you, Comptroller, for being here. I want to follow up with Raj had asked about the CARES Act 2 funding. Texas got $1.9 billion to the Texas Department of Housing and Community Services and rental subsidies. Do you know the status of that, and when would people start seeing that in landlords and renters' hands?
No, I actually have not followed that. So since you asked that question, I know my staff either looking it up now and trying to figure it out, and either send me a text real quick, or if not, then we can follow up with the group. So no, that's not one that I've followed recently. since it's not directly state expenditures, I haven't been as focused on some of those pass-through dollars these days. Good question, but let us see if we can try to get that answer for you.
Good deal. Thank you.
Yeah.
Andrea, I get a prize for stumping the controller, by the way, because nobody
Oh,
stumps the
is that-
controller. He always knows the answers. First time I think I've ever heard him not come back to something.
Well, there you go. Well,
You get the prize for today. We'll see if there's any other
Yeah.
prizes that have to be given out today. Andrea may not have enough gifts to share with everybody.
I have a
no.
mug. I have a tag mug for you, Mustafa. I'm sure you don't have any of these anywhere. All right. Well, so we'll hear feedback on that. I know Rob Maxwell is on from Jones and Carter, and he has a question. Lots of good questions today, by the way. Everybody's awake and has their coffee, so I'm excited. Rob?
Morning, Comptroller. Representative Ray Lopez from San Antonio has filed House Bill 207 relating to rates of gas taxes, gas and diesel fuel taxes. Has your office or others prepared estimates on revenue increases that would result if Governor Abbott was to sign this into law?
We have not as of right now. So once they get a committee hearing, then we'll look at it. TxDOT will look at it, and we'll prepare a fiscal note, but we don't have one right now. And so kind of the process is they file it, but once they get a hearing, then we'll start working on those fiscal notes. I think my office will end up doing probably about 1,500 during a legislative session out of the 7,000 plus bills that they'll file. So, you know, the point is we tend not to look at it until we know there's movement, because we got plenty of others that we've got to look at. So we haven't looked at it lately. There's probably some that we've done in the past, which if my folks can find it before we get off the call, then I'll mention some of those numbers. But I think the key point in a lot of that is if it's indexed, then obviously, you know, immediately there's not a significant impact to the state treasury. I made this point years and years ago as a new member, is that, you know, I know we talk a lot about, well, what's going to be the impact in this current 2-year biennium that they're budgeting for? Whereas if we look back 10 years ago, by now, there would be a significant impact. So I think, you know, the key is sometimes we tend to lose sight of, is there an immediate impact, or what's that impact in 5 and 10 years down the road? And I think, you know, indexing, that's a prime example of one of those that can have an impact over time. It just doesn't have that huge impact today.
Thank you.
But good question.
Thanks, Rob. And I know we're going to see some more legislation come, I think, from the Senate side on alternatively fueled vehicles and looking at those fee structures. I think we might even see some stuff for trucks as well. So on the House side. So the transportation bills have been a slower trickle than some of the others. So I know there's stuff coming. So we're just kind of waiting.
And, you know, part of that, just everybody knows, but, you know, from a legislative standpoint, you know, the Senate has committees announced, which is a lot easier because there was only just a few members that had changed. It's a lot easier to set committees for 31 members than 149 members when you take the speaker out of the 150 mix. So, you know, it usually takes a lot longer. Obviously with COVID, that's kind of being a little bit slower as well. But, you know, you'll see kind of a ramping up of some of those once you get committees and who's going to work on what, just because you don't know committee assignments yet. And so therefore, even if bills haven't been filed, that doesn't mean that, you know, members aren't working on them. It just takes a while. And I know Legislative Council, which is the lawyers that work for the legislature, that draft a lot of bills. Obviously, they're pretty backloaded right now. and so therefore, you know, the point being, just because you don't see it doesn't mean that people aren't working on it.
Right. Well, and I'm told that the bill drafting process, because again, COVID, right? There's some barriers there. You know, the inability to convene in a normal way to review a drafting of a bill is just, it's not the same. So, right. So that process is slower. So I think I'm going to take a minute and ask some questions about how session is kind of running from your lens. We have a new speaker. We have a Senate that's kind of taken off, you know, running. If you can give us a sense of just kind of the culture and the temperature as it relates to other sessions and just what you're seeing as far as kind of the personalities and how things are flowing.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the big important things is the big question is, well, how much legislation are they actually going to file? How much is going to be heard? And that's always an interesting discussion because especially now more than ever, people want to limit the amount of legislation that's being filed and heard. However, that usually applies to the other 180 members other than yourself. That member wants to file theirs and have theirs heard, but I don't want to have to hear everybody else's. And so, my point being is that kind of gets lost pretty quick. And so I think from a filing perspective, they're pretty much on pace of what they've normally been. However, I think the big question is how much is going to be heard. If you look at the Senate right now, even though they have committees, if I understand correctly right now, predominantly they're going to focus on Senate Finance, which is here in the budget that was introduced last week, and the Senate and the House introduced their first version of the budget as well. Both of them pretty close to each other, at least in dollar numbers. However, the Senate, obviously, since they have committees, are starting that budgeting process and redistricting. So don't forget that every 10 years we have redistricting, and this is a redistricting session. And so Senator Huffman started yesterday having hearings on redistricting. And so I think the Senate, at least from what I understand as of yesterday, plans to focus on those two committees for a while and not have hearings in all of the other committees for a little while. And so, the House, so, I think that the way it's going to work is probably going to be slower than normal, at least from a hearing perspective, and probably not the same number of volume that there has been in the past, just because, I get members that call me every day and, hey, can we get a meeting? Well, once you start, normally everything would be a meeting, in-person meeting, where now it's either, okay, well, let's set a phone call or let's set a video conference. So there's just not the same number of meetings. I mean, I think I've got 2 with members today and 2 tomorrow, but they're all virtual or they're phone calls. Not to mention the ones that will come in. And so, there's just not going to be the same traffic in the building as there has been in the past. So I do think it's going to end up being slower for the volume of things that are discussed and debated than there has been in the past.
Right. And so that was kind of my question. I have to go up and do an interview with, I guess it's Representative Canales, former chairman, maybe he keeps his chairmanship tomorrow. And so it'll be at the Greer building, but I'm curious about kind of what the vibe is at the Capitol, right? I think a lot of people on this call are kind of curious about that. And so, you go in, have to get your COVID test. And so can you just, from your vantage point, what that's been like to have to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just one that we're going to have to continue to navigate, week to week, and trying to figure out from a volume. In my office, for example, I mean, we're still teleworking. So we're going to be around the building. We're going to be around. I had a member last week that texted, hey, your office is calling and asking us what are our protocols. And you know what? I'm a little uncomfortable y'all asking that question. So I called him. I said, well, thank you for that. I said, but understand, we're the first ones that are typically in the building. I mean, we deal with the budget and the numbers. And so therefore, we just want to make sure, do you want us in your office? Do you not want us in our office? Do we wear a mask? Do we not wear a mask? Bring one person, 10 people? What is the shape and format? And then once I said, they go, oh, and I said, trust me, every other agency and every group in your district is going to ask you the same question. It's just my staff is ahead of the curve. And so, once and I just really hadn't thought about it from that perspective. And so, I think that there's going to be some stumbles is my point. This office wants this office wants that. And it's going to be really hard for us to kind of figure this out for a while. But, as of today, it's been pretty quiet. We haven't been in the building a whole lot just because they weren't in session last week. And even though they're in session this week, there's just not a whole lot of people in and around the building. And I think, honestly, they're still trying to figure it out. And at least I don't know about all of y'all's companies, but even though we're still pretty much predominantly teleworking, if you look at COVID numbers, at least as an agency, in the last 3 weeks, it's been about 30% of all of our COVID cases from our employees. And so over a 10-month period, it goes to show the fact is that Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, as we all knew, there would be a spike. And that spike is happening now. And so I think that's why, from a building perspective, they're much more hesitant to get full throttle just because of that issue, knowing that that's the fact in the case.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, our advocacy day is typically at the end of February. And so we're building it in a virtual way and trying to be creative with a video. And so that, I think there's a lot of questions that we get about what's it going to look like and when can we go? And while each office has different protocols and, by and large, nobody's coming up in any kind of a mass amount situation right now.
And I just don't think people will, to be honest,
Right.
and the fact is obviously we all knew that the vaccine rollout would be slow. I mean, the fact is there's a lot of logistical issues, not just to develop the vaccine, but to ship it, produce it, ship it, distribute it. And so, The point being is that that's going to be a slow process, and you're not just dealing with one vaccine, you're dealing with multiple vendors. And so therefore it's going to take a while. And with that being said, I just don't think you're going to see a full ramping up this legislative session as a result.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. I know that one of our former co-chairs on our board, Jeff Collins, has a question for you as well. Jeff, are you ready?
I'm ready. Good morning, Glenn. How are you?
I'm good, Jeff.
One question I had. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can even see you now.
Okay. Well, my computer's strained. Oh, there I am again. Education and property tax funding. That's been always a big deal the last couple of sessions. And I know this is a very complicated topic that can't be addressed in a.
But you're going to ask anyway, right?
I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay, go ahead.
How is the state going to look at funding that this time around? I know there was some one-time grabs last time. Does that look like it's kind of handled, and then you also have COVID funding been thrown in, and I would think federal money is helping cover that. But maybe a quick synopsis of what we're looking at on the education property tax.
Yeah, I think if you look at this current budget cycle, I entered in the House in 2003 when we had roughly a $10 billion deficit. I was there in 2011 when I was in the state Senate. We entered with a $4.5 billion deficit in the current 2-year budget. And then for the next budget, we had 22.5. So it was $27.5 billion, which, if y'all recall, was an absolute miserable session. The first time in Texas history since World War II, we didn't fund enrollment growth in public education, which we were having roughly 70, 90,000 kids additional in the public school system every single year. And so therefore it was a very difficult budget cycle. It didn't end up being as bad as we thought. The economy substantially took off here in Texas right after that. So many comparisons is this one to 2011 and 2003. In fact, when you take sales tax has not been as negative as we anticipated. The great financial crisis, sales tax was down roughly about 10% for 14 months. Well, this time, as I mentioned, it's been down about 5% so far. And so therefore not near as bad as people continue to engage in the economy on, a little bit more limited basis than fortunately than what we had anticipated. The online sales tax dollars have additionally helped. Obviously, there's a significant amount of money, the federal government. Part of that, as I mentioned directly, some of that is COVID related. They're going to be able to use some of that for state revenues. And so the current 2-year budget cycle, I think we're probably going to end up having a cash carryover balance, which is going to put us in good shape without having to use the rainy day fund. And then going forward, we haven't taken into account any additional federal dollars. We know the Biden administration wants to do something in the first 100 days, but the question is what? What does that look like? Is it directly stimulus checks? Who's going to get those stimulus checks? Are there dollars that directly help protect employee payroll? Is it to certain industry sectors? Is it state, local government? And so overall, the net public school funding that they did last cycle, which increased the state share and pressured down the local share increasing, looks as though they're probably going to be able to fund that. And as long as the economy holds to the projections that we provided, it could be better. Obviously, it could be worse because there's uncertainty out there, and every couple of months of information is extremely important. But on the current trajectory, it looks like with all those combined forces, in part the federal dollars too, the economy holding up better, the online dollars, it looks as though the current upcoming 2-year budget cycle, they'll be able to get through. Now, the introduced version of the bill that they provided, overall, we had said there's about $270 billion in all funds, state and federal, for the new 2-year budget. You typically just look at what we call general related revenue, which is the money they supposedly have discretion over. They really don't have much discretion, but it's supposedly they do. So that's the key number. And that number was $112.5 billion out of the full 270. Their bills they both introduced is about $100 million off of each, the House and the Senate, but it's $7 billion above what I told them they have revenue. Now, they wanted to start, I spoke to at least one side, they didn't want to start way down here. They wanted to start higher because they thought between all the combination of sources, plus if they have to, they have the ESF or the state savings account, they can get to their introduced versions. And I think, the fact is the federal dollars, when we're able to use some of those, that will put the budget in a better shape, the ones that we have received. So I think public education is going to be fine, is the short answer, Jeff.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. We have another question from one of our members on the chat, talking about the likelihood of the state accepting federal funds for Medicaid expansion this year. So I know that's been a back and forth issue for a while. So just thoughts on that going forward?
Yeah, that, you know, it's a lot bigger question than it has been in the past. You know, originally I was in the legislature when that topic first came up, and I was not for the expansion, in part because of the great concern that the federal government, which tends to do this fairly frequently, is here's all the money that you're going to get from the feds, and then ultimately it's going to be a state expense, and how are we ever going to pay for this? That was the biggest concern. Now, if you look today, you have 43 states that have done some type of Medicaid expansion, may not be full blown. Maybe it's a state plan. Oklahoma, Georgia, or two recently. We had sent out what we call a fiscal note article that talked about this issue, because in part, Texas, unfortunately, you know, you can't compare Texas to Delaware. You can't compare us to Idaho. I mean, you know, if you're comparing fruit to fruit, that's not an apple to apple comparison. It may be in the fruit category, but Texas is a much bigger state, a much more diverse state, a very large geographical state with a very diverse population set. And so, you know, my point being is, it's hard to compare us to some of these other states, but at the end of the day, Texas has the highest uninsured rate in the nation, unfortunately. Our rate has gone down over the course of the last several years, as all states. And so therefore, I think, you know, the point that we were writing about is, we're going to have to get a better handle on that uninsured population, and how do we address that issue? And so I'm not certain if the legislature will go in that direction this session, but I do think there are some things that we can do, because if you begin to look at it, the fact is with 43 states in some type of Medicaid expansion issue trying to deal with uninsured, the probability of the feds doing a switch and putting that burden on the states is probably gone down substantially as a result. Now, however, do I have questions and concerns, as in, how are we going to pay for this on the federal level for the long duration? No different than, you know, for every COVID package the feds pass, that's a temporary boost in the economy today. But the fact is, you're still going to have to figure out how to pay for this in the future. But with that being said, does that mean Texas say, oh no, we're not going to, you know, take those dollars, because the fact is we are paying in DC. They're just going somewhere else. So I'm not sure what direction the legislature will go in, but I do think we're going to have to come up with a Texas solution to reduce that overall uninsured population.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to say we have Michelle wants to ask another question, and his hand has been raised, and he's the only one that raised his hand. So I always am so pleased when I see people raise their hand properly. So take it away, Michelle.
Glenn, I'm not going to ask you to opine on a policy, but I'm interested in the toll road element. And you know, we have an anti-toll road sentiment today from certain people. My curiosity is, it would be interesting to see if there's any kind of a financial analysis that says, hey, if you use toll roads, that's what you get. If you don't use toll roads, that's what you get. I don't know if anybody approached you on that, or is something available to that effect, or is that something you can do or want to do, whatever. Just let me know what you think.
Yeah, no, we have not been approached. You know, I will say this, I do think that toll roads have to be part of the mix. They really do. But I also think that, you know, I'll use, for example, several years ago, obviously we still live in Katy, is where we call home. Even though I'm in Austin, I'm traveling, you know, not as traveling as much as I used to, but traveling around. And so I think most of y'all recall the discussion on the West Park Toll Road, whenever there was a discussion about raising the toll rates 8-10 years ago, and the pushback that was received. And obviously I was not one of the vote on that, but, you know, in hindsight, I think there should have been part of the discussion. Okay, well, even if it was going to be indexed to certain traffic congestion times of the day, which was the discussion point, we'll automatically come out and say, well, from, you know, midnight to 4 in the morning, I'm just making up a number, it's going to go to, you know, 20% of what the normal toll is. Nobody travels anyway. I mean, if you're going to index, don't keep it at a minimum floor, you know, at the current rate and then increase it. you need to decrease too, where you give real incentives. And so I think, if you talk in those kind of frames, people can appreciate and understand. And I think too, we have to continue to do an education perspective, because so many people think, well, once a toll road opens, it's automatically a cash driven operation for that entity or that region. And we all know, people always ask, probably ask you, same as they ask me, when is that road project ever going to get finished? Well, no sooner you finish it, there's repairs to be made. I mean, it's an everlasting, ongoing process because it's a used asset. And so therefore, I think toll roads are part of the mix. However, obviously you can't toll everything, and we shouldn't toll everything. But I think we also need to look at it in a perspective of an education perspective, that there's ongoing requirements to maintain and pay off those debts on that toll, even if it is a profitable operation. And how do you index it to truly deal with congestion type issues? I think need to be part of the mix. That's a different part of the discussion, but I think it's extremely important.
I just wonder how we can carry that discussion forward, given the anti-toll sentiment. I mean, you give me some numbers and logical, obviously, arguments, and I wonder why this is not taking, why there is resistance to that. It's just interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think any type of issue, there's going to be a certain number of people that I'm opposed to this just because I don't want it to be built, or whatever reason. And then it kind of takes up that mantra as we absolutely don't want any tolls. And I think the real part of the discussion needs to continue to remind people, well, we all want vehicles to travel further with fewer miles traveled, fewer gallons traveled, more miles per gallon. But that also means, well, then you're traveling more, you're wearing the roads out with less dollars going in to the highway system. And I think there's a disconnect there sometimes. And we just don't think about it. We're busy. We have our family, our daily lives, and you don't connect those dots. And I think it's important to connect those dots, kind of like, you were talking about, well, what about electric vehicles? What about alternative fuels that are being used for vehicles? Is that pure a money grab by government, or is that trying to maintain some sustainability in the transportation system and provide an incentive? Well, if I can leave for work at 6:30 versus 7 o'clock, and the toll rate may be slightly different. Well, if you can drive a number of people on the toll roads at that hour, then guess what? We all get there quicker, which is what we want to do. We don't want to sit in the traffic, and that's better for the environment. It's better for our attitudes. It's better for everything. But I think it's hard to have those discussions, unfortunately, as we all know. Man, I even got 2 thumbs up.
You did. That's great.
He did a hand raise and thumbs up.
That's great. Great question. So speaking about numbers and data, we have Tim Lomax on from TTI, and I know he had some questions for you, Comptroller. Tim?
I wanted you to ask my question. Okay, Comptroller, you spoke about the numbers on the online sales tax. Can you do the math for us on, if you hadn't gotten that provision, what would the percentage reduction in sales tax be? Would it be close to the Great Recession numbers? 10%?
If let's see, if Alberhan, I think sales tax receipts have roughly a little over $30 billion. And so that's just rounded up for math purposes, instead of 1.3 to 1.5 billion, just for simple math purposes. And so, you're looking at 5% potential swing there, which is a significant amount of money. I mean, I know 1.3 billion is not a lot to y'all, but it is to me. That's real money to Glenn Hegar.
I'll give you a verbal thumbs up on that. Thank you.
Which, one of the points I make to the legislature in passing that is that a lot of people compare Texas and Florida because we have similar tax systems. Neither one of us are income tax states. Both are more dependent on sales tax. And Florida, do you know what they did on that issue? Zero, nothing. And so therefore, as purchases have been moving more and more online over time and increasing, but the pandemic has just pushed it off the cliff as people are having that much more purchases. And so, and I continue to make the point too, like I said earlier, if y'all recall, is that it doesn't just impact state government, but it also impacts local municipalities MUD districts, special use districts, as the overall, all 1,700 local jurisdictions that derive some percentage of their budget from sales tax. I mean, that was $350 million that they wouldn't have received otherwise. And for me, it's a fairness issue, is that if I'm going to my local store down the street compared to online, well, you'd like to continue to incentivize those bricks and mortar mom and pop stores or big stores, whichever. And it's a fairness system. You know, if you buy it from a big box store online, you don't pay sales tax, you go to the store, you actually pay it. And, you know, if we're going to keep our system, we got to have and maintain that fairness in the system.
Right. No, agreed. Thank you. And kind of in the same format of numbers and TTI, Jay Crosley had a question. We know that we run a lot of numbers on the cost of congestion, right, statewide. Yeah. His comment, and Tim, maybe you can also help with this, running numbers on the cost of crashes and fatalities, right, statewide. And I think looking for who leads on that. I know the legislature has asked and commissioned studies for certain things, but I don't know if that's kind of a comptroller's office look at assessing those costs, or if that's more of a TTI role. But if there has been that done, is it time to do another review of that and to kind of see what the impact is?
So I'll say, at least that's not something that we've looked at, but I think that's an interesting point. You know, what I've tried to do when I first got in this job, and I think, you know, it's kind of a question earlier, is I'm not going to put you on the spot from a policy standpoint. Y'all probably heard me as others, is that I tried to make the transition from the legislative branch to the executive branch, that I'm not the policymaker. Yet with that being said, that doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about policy type issues. I may not tell them this is how I would vote, because I don't have a vote anymore, but I need to frame up and tee up the issues that are out there. And so that's what we try to do, at least through our fiscal note articles every couple of months. Major issues, again, you know, you asked the Medicaid and the uninsured issue. Well, we talked about it because it's a big deal and it's something that we need to rise to the forefront. And so I haven't actually ever thought, until you brought up kind of the, you know, the congestion or the casualty issues with fatalities and accidents, whether it's from the insurance perspective, both automobile as well as medical, those expenses that are in the hospital system, fatalities with lives, lost productivity, and families impacted. I mean, those are, you know, it's not something we've written about, but that might be something that maybe we kind of help put into context for the legislature, because there's a lot of dots sometimes to connect on this policy. It's not just a one type issue, but a connectivity. So we have not done it. We haven't looked at it. I haven't asked my staff, but you bring up an interesting point that we may look at now.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you. And thank you, Jay, for, he says that's a very awesome response. So thank you for that. I want to go back to talking about the waiver legislation and how that was actually legislation that was requested from your office. And so looking at this session, can you share legislation that you think that you're going to be requesting, if at all, for this session?
Yeah, there's a wide range of things that we're looking at. Some of it is just trying to update state statute, the tax code, bring it in compliance with what modern times is, even that, you know, nothing controversial, it's simplistic stuff, right, or untying our hands from a definition standpoint. So there's a lot of little things out there. My process is, after a legislative session, let's implement what we have to. And by the back end of the year, in other words, an odd given year, I tell all my division directors to start adding to their list, either things that we haven't done, things that we didn't try, things that we did try, didn't get accomplished, or new things. And then work that process to where through the summer before session, me and my exec team whittle it down to a manageable list. Now, the debate that we've had for several months and the debate that we're actually still having, like going back to your question, is what is session going to look like? I don't think that we're going to be able to try to go for that full list. We need to dwindle it down, because the reality is, why try if they're not even going to get to it?
Right.
And so we're still, something that we would have finalized that a long time ago. We're still kind of having that debate, which kind of goes to show you that they're not going to tend to a lot of these things. And some committees have just said, look, if it's not a must have for the agency, don't even talk to us about it. I mean, we've been told that by some committee chairs, that we're just not going to hear them. And so, you know, we're still trying to figure out, is that going to be the norm, or what is the norm? So there's nothing real major on our list. There's nothing as substantial as a wayfare decision. That one was very big, a one-time type issue that needed to be addressed, that you needed to address, and I'm glad that we did. But
Right,
there's
the
none
timing.
on the list.
Yeah.
Right timing. There's none on the list right now that would fundamentally change state revenues and or policy in one direction or another. It's a lot of smaller type stuff.
Okay. So looking at the budget process, Senate put out the first draft of the budget, and everyone's kind of scurrying to see what's been changed or modified or cut. Transportation, nothing was touched. Hopeful that we stay that way. But my question is not so much about the cutting of the transportation dollars, but the mechanism with how we're funding it, right? And we talk about the volatility of oil and gas, and that's got to speak overall, not just for transportation. So in your mind, I think we've learned that while it is a blessing that we have the oil and gas because it's unique to Texas in many ways, it's also something that we have to monitor very carefully because we've got a lot tied to it. So can you share, kind of looking ahead, what you see as responsible, I guess, being proactive and looking at our budget and looking at our rainy day fund and how we fund these things as it's tied to oil and gas? How do we start to shift? How do we start to look at that and say, maybe we shouldn't tie as much to oil and gas as we have in the past?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think absolutely right. I mean, last session, there was some discussions by some members that, hey, let's use increases in oil and gas collections to fund public education.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was even before session, I was asked that question and said, yeah, bad idea. Most volatile revenue streams. Some members said, oh, it's going to go off the chart from here forever. It is not going to slow down. And I'm thinking, we just had one in 2015 and 16. I mean, memories fade very quickly. We were impacted in the Houston region. Those that don't live in the areas, and even those that do, sometimes they forget so quickly. And so, my point is that the one that's most impacted potentially in that ebb and flow is transportation funding. That's the one that's most impacted. But the fact is, I think that overall the state treasury, we're going to have these ups and downs in the cycles. The biggest benefit is Texas continues to be an attractive state for people to expand or relocate, and so that helps Texas in so many ways that other states don't have that. I think any types of fixes is trying to make sure that you take out some of the volatility. There's not a one big fix to it. However, it's little pieces, a little here and a little there. One of the things that, if I look at long-term liabilities, something that I continue to talk about a lot about is our pension system, especially our employee retirement pension system. And, those in the Houston area try to deal with pension issues on a city level. And so therefore that's something from a long-term perspective that we need to try to address as well. And so that's more of expenses than a revenue, but you got to deal with both is my point. And so I think, trying to maintain a healthy economy and a prosperous economy as a business-friendly economy, that is the most critical piece, because a growing economy helps overcome some of these issues that we have. There's still challenges, but it's better than going in the other direction. And then trying to find solutions here and there that are smaller, but not trying to go for the grand slam. It's kind of like get a base hit, get on base. You just got to keep doing the small things, I think, because in all, they add up eventually at the end.
Right. And I think it makes the case for, when we talk about alternatively fueled vehicles and equity and those conversations, while it's a small number now, we have to start looking at things like that because it's going to make a dent, on the funding at some point. Right.
And that's the reason you've heard me over and over talking about, at least for the Wayfair type dollars, that's a fairness issue.
Right.
People get that. If you talk about it, oh, well, then government just wanted their hands on that money. Well, but it's also a competitive disadvantage to the store that's right down the street. We all want to support our local stores, or why should it be that if I buy from a box store in the store, then they charge it, but if it's online, that just makes no sense. So, you got to kind of get down to it from that fairness perspective. And then people go, oh, well, why do I want them having a competitive advantage? And I think a lot of these things fit into the same mold as my point. And some of the small issues that we're trying to address in a tax system, as technology changes and time changes, you don't want to have a complete erosion. You want to make sure that fairness is in the system. And I think people can appreciate that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you so much. My final question relates to a conversation we had probably towards the beginning of COVID. And I'm just curious if your basketball skills have improved at all with your daughter. And I know you were working on that a bit while
No,
taking calls.
we were just working on that yesterday afternoon, and I told her this morning, I said, all right, this afternoon, you and I are going to get out there. She started basketball, and so we're starting on those skill sets. Yeah, it's amazing how, any of y'all that been parents, it's a jack of all trades. I've told people, my youngest daughter, who's the sports fanatic, the one that's practicing our basketball skills right now, she loves sports. She's always talking about all these sports. And Glenn, he doesn't care. But he doesn't know that. It is the most important thing in my life. So my kids' love is my love. And so, yes, my skills have actually improved a little bit, but don't ask me to dunk a ball anytime soon. That's not going to happen. I'm still vertically challenged, and I will continue to be vertically challenged.
Very good. Well, thank you again for your time today. I'm really great questions. This was a great discussion, and we really appreciate all that you know and all that you share and all that you do for the state.
And thanks again for y'all's time. Last thing I'll mention, if there's any follow-up questions or issues, then just funnel those, through the group and send them to my staff. You've got all the contacts, and so just send them to us, and we'll be happy to get back with you. Okay.
Kristen,
y'all. I hope y'all have a productive day.
Okay. Thank you so much, Comptroller. Take care. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you, first of all, to TAG for all that you're doing, and thank you for thinking about those families who need.
I hope to see y'all soon. I appreciate your work, your advocacy, not just during the session, but post-session.
You're innovators, visionaries, and I really appreciate that.
Appreciate the friendships that I've had with the transportation community.
Thank y'all for putting these on. It's just a really great idea, and thank you to everyone that's watching.
Definitely thank you to TAG for keeping us connected, continuing to keep us connected even in these unprecedented times.
We're all in this together. We will come out of this together. We will definitely be stronger together.